The number one question that students ask me or post on online forums like Reddit or College Confidential is, which factors matter the most in my admissions chances? And the answers they have in mind are their essays, their academics, resume, SAT scores, and those things obviously matter. But in this video, I'm going to make a potentially controversial argument that your individual efforts matter less than the zip code and community that you were born and raised, and the high school that you attend. Wealth inequality is arguably the most significant problem confronting Americans, but also populations around the world today. Yale professor Daniel Markovits wrote the book, The Meritocracy Trap, which was really important and something that I cite throughout my book, Surviving the College Admissions Madness. And Markovits examines the origins and persistence of economic and educational inequality in the United States. And these are topics that are central to who gains admission to elite universities today. Markovits cites research that the achievement gap between rich and poor students today is more extensive than between white and black students in the early 1950s on the eve of desegregation. Families with wealth outside of the top 5% are increasingly left behind. Wealthy states such as Connecticut spend more than twice as much per student on public education than poorer states like Mississippi. Private schools spend on average 6 times more per pupil and employ twice as many teachers, who are often more experienced and highly qualified than their public school counterparts. Less than 2% of American students attend private schools, yet they occupy a quarter of the enrollment spaces at Ivy League universities. And some private schools send up to 50 students each year to Harvard. There was a recent article in The Atlantic by Caitlin Flanagan, and she sums up the divide between elite private schools and public schools in underserved communities. And she wrote, "Many schools for the richest American kids have gates and security guards. The message is, you are precious to us. Many schools for the poorest kids have metal detectors and police officers. The message is, you're a threat to us." A Harvard, Princeton, and Yale alumni survey found 3/4 live in zip codes that rank in the top 20% by income and education. And half of those alumni live in zip codes in the top 5% based on income and education. And that's understandable because people want to mix with and marry those from similar educational backgrounds and who hold common interests. And one benefit of whenever you connect so many wealthy and educated people together is the family and community networks that can connect students with prestigious seeming internships that aren't accessible to less privileged families. And these are the internships when people post on Reddit, and clients of mine also wonder, like, I don't have a mom or dad that is a research professor at a university. How do they secure these opportunities? And the reality is that things like PTA donations, community fundraisers, and other types of support can support niche arts or sports activities or connect students to highly advanced types of technological opportunities. And that means admissions is less a reflection of a level playing field. Instead, it tilts heavily in favor of those where the wealth is concentrated in a handful of zip codes. Families earning more than $250,000 annually, with parents holding graduate degrees, are vastly overrepresented at elite universities. Forbes' list of the top 20 private high schools send 30% of their graduates to the Ivy League, Stanford, and MIT, which Daniel Markovits cites in The Meritocracy Trap as about 1/10 of the total available spaces at those elite universities. Coming from wealth is a necessary condition for most incoming elite college students. And there's this myth that universities nowadays are over-enrolling or admitting many times more the number of first-generation or low-income or underrepresented minority students, and that simply isn't true. The reality is that given the increasing competition, It's more like affluent students are competing against one another, and therefore affluence isn't sufficient for getting in, although it's usually a necessary criteria. And insecurities about getting in amplify affluent family anxieties. Students living in wealthy zip codes largely compete against one another, and not underrepresented or first-generation population students. Markovitz estimates that the students in the top income quarter outnumber those in the bottom quarter by 14-1 at America's 150 most competitive colleges and universities. And at America's top 20 universities, the divide widens from 72% for top quarter students versus 3% for the bottom quarter. Less than 3% of students at Yale Law, where Markovitz teaches, grew up in or near poverty. He calculates that the excess investments in human capital made in a typical rich household today are equivalent to a traditional inheritance in the neighborhood of more than $10 million per child. And he concludes that meritocrats may be made rather than born, but they're not self-made. Another professor, this time at Harvard, Michael Sandel, he wrote the book, The Tyranny of Meritocracy. He cites research that an applicant from the top 1% is 77 times more likely to gain admission to an Ivy League school compared with a student from the bottom 20%. And although universities are much more accessible for students from diverse backgrounds based on gender, race, culture, or sexual orientation than at any time in the history of the United States, the Ivy League and its equivalents collectively enroll more students from the top 1% of American society than the bottom half. And in fact, there's more than 36 universities in the United States that enroll more students from the top 1% than the bottom 60%. And that means that need-blind admissions or financial aid guarantees matter little if few low-income or first-generation students gain admission. And it's ironic that you have British aristocratic traditional champions like Oxford and Cambridge, who now enroll more socioeconomically diverse student bodies than their diversity evangelizing American peers. Access to substantially more resources gives wealthy students considerable advantages. In a follow-up article, Daniel Markovitz wrote in The Atlantic an article titled, How Life Became an Endless, Terrible Competition, where he writes that only about 1 in 200 children from the poorest third of households achieve SAT scores at Yale's mean. The gap between wealthy and middle-class children is growing substantially faster than between the middle class and families living in poverty. Middle-class families who don't make enough money or have the financial stability to save for college are increasingly priced out of elite educations. And yet, often, they earn too much to benefit from need-based financial aid schemes. Middle-class millennials were the first generation in American history less likely to make more money than their parents. And Gen Z seems to be following the same trajectory as they begin and graduate college during a global pandemic. In practice, the American dream is an illusion. The United States is 2 to 3 times less socially mobile than supposedly socialist countries like France, Germany, Sweden, Canada, Finland, Norway, and Denmark. That means if you're born outside of the top quintile of wealth in America, there is an overwhelming chance that you will die earlier and with the same or less wealth than your parents. Generation Z works harder than perhaps any cohort of teenagers, yet they're villainized by the baby boomer generation. Society fails to provide them with adequate job prospects or pathways to earn college degrees that don't entail a lifetime of debt. Michael Sandel summarizes this lack of social mobility bluntly when he says, relatively few children of the poor rise to affluence, and relatively few children of affluence fall below the ranks of the upper middle class. Exceptions like hillbilly elegy author J.D. Vance, who published acclaimed memoirs because his experience of overcoming Appalachian poverty and graduating from Yale Law is so uncommon. And if achieving the American dream were the rule and not the exception, they wouldn't show us films like October Sky or Stand and Deliver in our high school and middle school classes. There wouldn't be a subgenre of overcoming adversity and working through poverty if it simply were the case that American society were more socially mobile, where people living in poverty had the structural ability and access to resources that allow them to ascend to the upper classes. And valorizing anomalous and exceptional people who rise above poverty transfers the failings of inaccessible elite universities onto the moral failings of individuals. Proof of the inequality is in the movies and books that we watch and that we read and listen to. J.D. Vance, for example, published the popular memoir, Hillbilly Elegy, where he overcame Appalachian poverty to graduate from Yale Law. And his experience is so uncommon that we make Netflix specials about it. And the same is true with movies like Stand and Deliver, that valorize an exceptional teacher in a low-income school, or October Sky, where you have a student coincidentally from Appalachia who becomes a rocket scientist. But valorizing anomalous and exceptional people who rise above poverty transfers the failings of inaccessible elite universities onto the supposed moral failings of individuals and families. I agree when New York University professor Scott Galloway remarks that higher education in the United States has morphed from the lubricant of upward mobility to the enforcer of our caste system.
Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe. You can find my email in the information section of this video, so feel free to reach out if you're interested in working together.